Truly, he is worthy to be praised and to be lifted up and to be exalted on this day. We certainly want to thank all who came out to our revival on this past week. We had a wonderful time. Dr. Charles Vincent came through and really blessed us with powerful words of encouragement to keep us moving forward in the name of God. And so we just want to thank all those who came and those who had the desire to be here but couldn't come. We just thank you nonetheless. Today we're coming out of the book of First Peter. If you've been around me, long enough this past year, that's kind of where we've been, where God has been leading me in rendering sermons to the house on fourth Sundays and every Sunday that He's had me to preach so far. And so we're going to dive right into First Peter on today. Today we're in chapter 2, and we're starting with verse number 13. And in the interest of time, you don't have to stand. I'm just going to read it in its entirety, and then we're going to move forward from there. First Peter chapter 2, starting at verse 13, says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, that when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving an example for you that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." And for a subject on this morning, I simply want to say what faith looks like at work. What faith looks like at work. Backtracking a little bit to where we are today, Peter is talking to elect exiles, these dispersed disciples who are scattered throughout these 5 different regions. And we talked about these regions not being places where God is truly magnified in the land. They're living in places that are serving these idol gods, the gods of sex, the god of money, the god of power, the god of fame, the god of glory, so on and so forth. But they're not serving the true and living God. And so these elect exiles, these dispersed disciples, they have come together as Peter has written this letter to them to tell them that you are a chosen race, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people for his own possession, to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness and into the marvelous light. And that sounds really good when we think about it, because in the world that we live in today, it's very easy to feel alone, to feel isolated, to feel by ourselves. So to know that we are a chosen race, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, that allows us some level of comfort to know that we're not in this by ourselves. But then at the very same time, Peter tells them that as sojourners and exiles in a world that is put up against you, that bucks up against you, we must be mindful, as it says in verses number 11 and 12, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Now, what Peter is doing in those 2 verses is he's setting up a way for us to see what faith looks like at work. Because it's easy for us to talk about faith and God in this house. But it's a totally different thing to live it outside these walls. It's very easy to put on the suits and put on the dresses and put on the hats and put on the shoes, put on the accessories and look the part of sanctification, look the part of holiness on an 11 o'clock worship service. But it's something totally different to go outside these walls and Monday through Friday go to work and still have God resonating in our hearts. It's very easy to come to church and worship God, but it's harder to live the life of Christ outside of the church walls. Why? Because we're being put up against the wiles of this world in every corner of our world. We're not blessed to have, not all of us are blessed to have jobs where we get to talk about faith 24/7. Not all of us are blessed to be in positions where we can have free conversation about the goodness of Jesus and all that he's done for us. For some of us, if we even mention the name Jesus in any capacity, that's grounds for termination. And so it's very difficult for us to speak about God in the places that we live, in the places that we work. And so what Peter is telling the disciples here is that when you are going to work, when you are going to your vocations, when you're going to the schools, when you're going to these places where these other gods reign, we have to keep our conduct honorable among them. See, what often happens is that when we become saved, when we become sanctified, Holy Ghost filled, fire baptized, and whatever other phrase you want to call it, we will sometimes isolate ourselves from the very people that God has called us to reach. Because we get so frustrated with them not being like us that we'll separate ourselves from them. We forget that we were once like them, and we isolate ourselves from the very people that God is calling us to reach. So what's often the case is that the very people that God has on your job, that you are meant to be a light that shines in the darkness, instead of reaching out to them, instead of being honorable to them, we keep ourselves closeted, where our faith is hidden among ourselves so that we can maintain our job, so that we don't have to speak out, that we don't have to speak against. But then when we go home, I can't believe she did this because that's not of God. I can't believe she did that because that's not of God. I can't believe she said what she said when she said it. And if it were me, I wouldn't have done that. If it were me, I would have blah, 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 blah. But then when you get right back to work the next day, hey, how you doing? You all right? Oh, okay, that's good. Well, I hope you have a good day. I can't believe this person right here. This is the same person who yesterday was cussing this person out, and now she's sitting there smiling and face. Blah, blah, blah. This is how we become hypocrites. When we put on the mask for Sunday, we put on the mask in front of friends, we put on the mask in front of people who are like us, but then when we are out in the world, out about doing our thing, we hide the light. The light that is to shine in darkness. The same light that shone when you were in darkness is the same light that's in you that is to shine in darkness. The whole purpose of being a light is to shine in darkness, not to shine in light. For light exposes the darkness. So we find that Peter is setting up this way of showing faith in the midst of daily living. And in this first part, we see that he's talking about submitting to leadership. Submitting to leadership. He says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. See, God is the ruler of our souls. He is the overseer of our lives. He is the reason for our existence. So if we are saved, we have tethered ourselves, we've attached ourselves to his authority. Whatever God says we do, that's what we're going to do. Whatever God says we're going to say, that's what we're going to say. Whatever God wants us to believe, that's what we're going to believe. But in the midst of the overarching structure that God has set up for himself, he has placed people in our lives who rule over us. Presidents, governors, CEOs, managers, presidents of companies, so on and so forth. And these are the people that we work for. These are the people that we submit to primarily for a paycheck, but more so because this is what God has called us to do. And so in the midst of these leadership structures, God is calling us to submit to them. Now, this can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. Because often is the case that when we are submitting to leadership, we want to pick and choose who we're going to submit to. If this person is a good leader by our standards, then we'll do everything they say. We'll be loyal. We'll do what you tell us to do. We'll whatever it is that you want us to do. You want us to clean. You want us to serve. You want us to live. We will do whatever it is that you want us to do. Why? Because you're a good leader to me. But let us get up under that bad manager. Let us get up under that manager that can't stand us, whether it's because of the color of our skin, the content of our heart, the way that we think, or the way that we see things differently than them. They have a nasty, snooty attitude when they walk through the doors every day, and as soon as they see you, the first thing they want to say is blankety blank, blank, blank. And when we get up under those leaders, our minds have the tendency to say, I can't stand coming to work. I can't stand being here. I can't stand working for you. I can't stand this. I can't stand that. Why? Because this is a bad leader. And for all intents and purposes, yes, they are a bad leader. But God calls us to submit. In the world that we live in, that doesn't make sense. Because we live under the idea that I'll respect you if you respect me. I'll show you love if you show me love. I'll show you favor if you show me favor. I'll forgive you if you forgive me. Now, what if God was like that? What if God said, I'll forgive you if you turn away from your sins? I will love you if you do what I tell you to do. I'll find favor with you if you stop doing the things that you do. See, we don't serve a God of if. Because when we were enemies, when we were sinners, when we were thrown by the wayside, when we were all up in our mess, Christ died then. He didn't wait for us to clean ourselves up. He didn't wait for us to make ourselves better. He didn't wait for us to put on the suits and put on the clothes and walk into the church. No, he met us in our mess. He met us in our mistakes. He met us in our shortcomings. In those places, Christ died for us. And the same grace that he showed us is the same grace that we should show all people, regardless of how they treat us, because we treated God the exact same way. When we were out and about doing the things that we wanted to do, yes, we slapped God in his face. When we were doing things that are so ungodly in the sight of mankind, we were slapping God in his face. Yeah, we may have hurt people, but we hurt God first. And yet, while we were hurting him, Christ died. So that same love, that same forgiveness, that same understanding that he showed us is the same love, understanding, and forgiveness that we are to show to bad leadership. Because we're all image bearers of God. God created all of us. Despite where we are, despite what we're doing, despite whether we have a relationship with God or not, we are to respect all people as Christ's image bearers. And as such, it makes submitting to leadership difficult when the leadership is horrible. That's why it says in verse 18, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Now, let me backtrack a little bit. Because these verses, unfortunately, ain't nothing we can do about it, but these verses were once used as a means of trying to get slaves, particularly our slaves, African American slaves, to submit to some horrible leadership. And in no way, shape, and form are these verses a means to try to enslave anyone. So for the ones who did do that, shame on them, because that's not what this is saying. It's not saying that if someone's beating us senseless, or if someone's just taking us down and then saying, well, you're doing good, so you're going to suffer, and so you're going to get favor from God anyway. That's not what this is saying. Looking at it contextually, servants back in those days, they served for hire. And so these weren't slaves that were in chains and in bonds. These slaves were slaves who actually worked for their independence. So they would work about 5, 6, or 7 years up under someone, and then afterwards they were either given their freedom or they were promoted to another position. And so these servants then were not necessarily, they were not the ones who that we're so used to seeing on movies like Roots and things like that. These servants were actually hired workers. Now, still to that point, they had some very horrible bosses. And again, it's just like us today. Some of us are blessed with some very good, wonderful bosses who will, give you the shirt off their back. They will help you in any way. But some of us work for some really nasty people. Just keeping it real. Here it is. Be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Jesus said it like this: blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When we suffer for righteousness' sake, God honors that. God honors those who endure hard times for his sake and not their own. God honors those who put up with horrible bosses and put up with horrible leadership for his sake. Because when we suffer, we are partaking in the fellowship of the sufferings of Christ. We have to remember, Christ suffered. He suffered though he never did anything wrong. Probably the worst thing that he did was to clear out the temple of people who were exchanging money for doves. That's probably the most horrible thing. If there is a horrible thing that he did, that's probably the most horrible thing that he did, was getting people kicked out of the church because they were using the church for the wrong reason. And so if Christ suffered though he never did anything wrong, how much more shall we suffer, even though we may not necessarily be doing anything wrong? We go to work, we clock in, we do our job, we clock out, we go home, we respect everyone as much as we can, we do everything that we're supposed to do, and yet there are still some people who are going to treat us badly, especially if they know that we're saved. Sometimes we'll have those bosses who are just picking on us just to see whether or not we will fall out of union with God so we can pick a fight with them just so they can say in their minds, I knew she wasn't saved. I knew I could push their buttons. I knew I could make them feel a certain way. I knew I could get them to come out of character. How much are we willing to suffer in the name of God? A lot of times in the world that we live in today, we are so accustomed to hearing things like YOLO. You only live once. It's my life. I'm going to do what I want to do. God's not finished with me yet. Get rich or die trying. So we want to be our own bosses. We want to be our own managers. We want to be our own CEOs. And we don't want to submit to anyone or anything. We don't want to fall down upon anyone. We don't want to have a relationship where we have to follow somebody. We want to do what we want to do. This is a plague within the society today where we are making gods out of ourselves. Where we are making ourselves more important than God himself. Where if you're not doing what I want you to do, well, fine, I'm just going to go find me another job where it'll let me do what I want to do. And so we find ourselves doing 5 or 6, 7 different jobs without submitting to one. Without submitting to one leader. Without submitting to one authority head. Mind you, you're going to have some hard times. You're going to have some bad bosses. You're going to have some horrible leadership. And yet God says, submit. Why? Because our job is to make God large, to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness and into the marvelous light. If that is our task, then these bosses we might have, God has placed them in our sphere because it might be us that has to shine the light before them so that they may see our good works despite the opposition that they bring toward us, and they might give God the glory. We are too accustomed to thinking that when we're suffering or when we're going through, that it's a sign of the works of the devil, and I need to move, and I need to get out of position. I need to do something. I need to move forward because my destiny is at risk. But have we ever stopped and considered that maybe the suffering that you're going through is designed by God himself to teach you to humble yourself? Is it possible that God has put you up under a leader of some kind, whether good or bad, so that you can learn how to submit to him? There's a lot of times we are up under people who don't know God. They do, but they don't have a real relationship with him. What happens then when God places us up under them? It is our task not to try to change them, not to try to convert them, but to let God be large in our lives. To let God shine forth in the midst of the darkness that we may see. For this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Jesus committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in the body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By your wounds you have been healed. This is why it is so imperative, it is so important that the gospel of Jesus Christ resonate in your hearts. That it be the centerpiece through which every decision that you make is made. The gospel of Jesus Christ is so important because without it you will perish. You will succumb to the pressure of this world every single time you forget the gospel. Every single time you forget that Christ died for you while you were in the midst of your mess. When someone says something to you that you don't like, you'll find yourself putting people on blast on Facebook, knowing good and well that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You'll find yourself putting people on blast on Instagram and on Twitter when you know that's not what you're supposed to be doing. But if you're not resting in the gospel, how can you remember what God said about you? I had someone call me yesterday and she said that she was succumbing to the pressure of trying to be such a great worker on her job, and it's because she didn't know who she was outside of being who she was at work. And I said the problem is not the fact that you don't know who you are. The fact is the problem is that you don't remember who God said you are. You don't remember that God said you are a child of the King. You don't remember that he said that I died just for you. You forget that God said I made you, I formed you, I shaped you, I molded you. I knew you before the foundations of the world. Before you were in your mother's womb, I already had you in mind. I designed everything about you, the good, the bad, the indifferent. I designed everything about you. But if you forget that, then yes, you're going to try to identify yourself with the job. You're going to try to identify yourself with how good of a work that you do. You're going to try to identify yourself with trying to make your boss, feel good by brown nosing and by sliding things up under the table. Why? Because you want to make yourself large while making God so small. And at the end of the day, when you've done all that work and you're sitting down at home wondering, why am I doing all of this? God will smack you in your face and say, because you forgot about me. We cannot forget the gospel of Jesus Christ, because anytime we let go of the gospel, that is Satan's opportunity to try to steer us away from what God has said about us. What God has reminded us of day in and day out. The 66 books all speak gospel. But if we're not trying to get into this word and dig into it and understand what it says about us and what it says about him and what it says about this world, then anytime the opposition comes, when that one person that you can't stand cusses you out, will you remember God or will you remember who you once were? This is how faith is at work. Because oftentimes we'll come into these sanctuaries and we'll put on the mask and say, for God we live and for God we die, and I'll serve him all days and I'll serve him always. And we lift up holy hands and we put everything before God's feet here in a worship service. But then when we go to work, everything that we put on the altar, we put back in our hearts. Everything that we say, God, I forsake all this for you, we'll then pick it right back up and go right where we left off. Faith at work says that we are to be honorable among the Gentiles. We are to be honorable among those who don't know who God is, because we are the sermon that they're looking at. When they won't come to a worship service, when they won't come to a Bible study, when they won't call anyone for prayer, when they won't go onto a website to think about the goodness of Jesus, you might be the very light that is sent to shine in a dark place. Your job is a battleground. And all God is asking us to do is to make him large in that place. Yes, we might have bad bosses. Yes, we may have people that we can't stand. We may work with people who don't like us or people who are plotting against us. But in the midst of all of that, are you making God large in that place? Are you doing a wonderful work for God? Now, I'm not again saying that we are to preach and proclaim and shout to the rooftops while we're on our job, but keep your conduct honorable. It should not be named among us as the saints of God that we are acting just like the world at work. It should not be named among us. Because if that's the case, what does that say about the gospel of Jesus Christ resonating in your hearts? Is it really there? Do you really know whether or not God is truly in your life? See, we have to understand that we have been healed by the stripes of Christ. We have been healed of our sinful condition. The very things that we accuse others of daily, God had to clean us up too. We have to be so careful in the world that we live in today that we don't point our fingers at anybody, that we don't stick our noses up at anyone, because Christ died for you too. And the same God that died for you is the same God that died for the boss, the same God that died for the employee, the same God that died for the spouse, the same God that died for the sister, the same God that died for your brother. That's the same God that died for you. So when they do you wrong, when they mistreat you, that is God trying to get you down on your knees to pray for them, to pray for the one who despitefully uses you, to pray for the one that abuses you. Why? Because they are only doing what they know to do because they're human. And the God that we serve is not resonating in their hearts. So it's not an opportunity to talk about them. We pray for them in hopes that the same God that saved me might save them too. And if I can be an example of what God's salvation looks like, let my light so shine before them that they might see my good works and might glorify the same God that I glorify. So yes, it might hurt sometimes to go on your job. It might hurt sometimes to deal with that coworker. It might hurt sometimes to deal with that brother or deal with that sister on a day in, day out basis. But if you can let your light shine before them by proclaiming the excellence of God, maybe one day that same brother or that same sister will come to you and say, I thank you. I thank you. Because even when I was doing you wrong, you never did anything back to me. You kept yourself cool. You kept yourself calm. And you kept yourself grounded in God. And I see now why you serve the God that you serve. Because it's only because of him that you didn't lose your mind. It's only because of him that you didn't throw in the towel. It's only by him that you didn't give up and say, for whatever to this. It's only because of him that you didn't forsake everything that you've worked for to do the things that you are called to do. And because of that, I want what you got. Will you be bold and stand for God in the midst of opposition? We're not all blessed to have great leaders. We're not all blessed to have great leadership. But at the end of the day, God calls us to submit to our leaders, to submit to those who are over us. Regardless of whether they treat us good or whether they treat us bad, we are all called to submit to leadership, not for the sake of the leader, but for the sake of God. For at the end of the day, it is God who gets the glory, God who gets the honor, and God who gets the praise. And no, this isn't a prosperity message, because you may not get the promotion. You might not get to be the CEO of that company. You may be in that position for the rest of your life. And yet, God is still a good God. Because what we say is, by the power of the gospel, I know that all this stuff's going to pass away anyway. And when this job is gone, someone's going to take my place, and they just going to keep the wheels turning. But I thank God that at the end of all of this, there is greater coming. There is a heaven and an earth that is coming. And I'm so glad that my name is on the book of life, so that at that great day when he cracks the sky, God's going to say to me, servant of God, well done, come on in. I want to make you ruler over many things. I want to be in that number. And I thank God that Christ died so I can be in that number. So let them have the job if they want it. Let them have the position if they want it. I don't need to be a CEO to feel accepted or to feel like I've made it in this world. I made it because Christ died for me. I made it because God gave his life so that I might have a chance to make it one day. So my focus is heavenward. My focus is there. Looking to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, so that at that great day, when all this is said and done, he'll say to me, servant of God, well done. Submit to your leadership for the sake of God. For at the end of the day, God honors submission. If you receive that word, clap your hands and give God praise.